Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk on advancing transit-oriented communities and planning in Los Angeles. Before we begin, let me note a couple of things about the session. The first is that closed captioning is available, if that would be helpful for you. To turn on closed captioning, just go to the live transcript item on your menu bar, or on the whatever we call that bar. On my screen, it's on the bottom at the right. I think for folks on iPads, it may be elsewhere. Second, this is a webinar. You can use Zoom's Q&A function to ask questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can, but I apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. And third, we will be posting the slide deck, and once we get it completely captioned, because what we're using for this session right now is an automatic captioning system that's good, but not perfect. We'll post a video of the talk. It'll probably be sometime in the middle of next week. So today we're thrilled to be hosting Lily Song, a Joint Center faculty affiliate who is a lecturer in urban planning. And Lily's going to be talking about work that was supported in part by the center's student research support program that she and 3 students have been doing with the Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles. She'll be joined today by 3 of those students. There are more students that have worked on it. Elifmina Mizrahi, who is a MUP, Fiona Riley, who's getting a master's in architecture. MUP is master's in urban planning, of course, and Anne Lin, who is a joint degree MUP, Master in Public Health student. The 4 of them will speak for a little bit more than a half an hour, and then we'll take questions for about a half an hour. We'll wrap up at approximately 1:15 p.m. Lily, since you're kicking us off, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hello, everyone. I'm Lily Song. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers. Thanks for inviting us to be here with you today. I'm currently Zooming in from Somerville, Massachusetts, where I'm an uninvited guest on Wampanoag territory. By way of introduction, I'm an urban planner who came into the field from a community organizing background. Growing up in an immigrant Korean family in a Los Angeles ethnoburb on occupied Tongva land, I was politicized by the '92 LA uprising, which made me aware of my positionality in LA's stratified racial, ethnic, and class geography. It motivated me to pursue an ethnic studies major at UC Berkeley and later work as an organizer to build Asian, Black, Latinx solidarity while mounting community health and environmental justice campaigns in South LA and the South Bay with the Asian American Drug Abuse Program and Community Coalition. I entered the urban planning program at UCLA 15 years ago, mostly to better understand how to address structural roots of spatial injustice and learn to fight forward. I've been lucky enough to continue researching and learning in relationship with place-based activist networks in LA and beyond. As David mentioned, at the GSD, I'm a lecturer in urban planning, and I'm also the founding coordinator for Co-Design, which is a school-wide initiative to tighten links between design teaching, research, practice, and activism. Through Co-Design, I work with incredible emerging designers and planners like Fiona, Anne, and Elifmina, who will be sharing some of their work today. To situate this work with ACT LA in time and place, I'd like to share this quote by the great community builder and movement architect, Grace Lee Boggs. What does it mean to be a human in the 21st century? We know that the 21st century is not only a time of grave physical and existential threats from climate change, global pandemics, winner-take-all markets, and vast socioeconomic disparities, but also movements for Black lives, queer liberation, climate justice, regenerative commons, and more. The Biden administration is now preparing trillions of dollars for public investments in critical infrastructure and services like transport, renewables, digital technology, education, workforce development. We know that the 20th century New Deal and Fair Deal, infrastructure investments in suburban development, highway and road construction, defense industries, and public education even reinforced racial segregation and uneven opportunity structures, as well as spatial sprawl and environmental destruction. So as planners and designers at the helm of these historic policies and investments in the 21st century, how do we radically repair not only physical infrastructures, but also the supremacist, profiteering, and carceral logics governing urban spatial production and management? How do we shift design methods and practices to accomplish existing efforts to decolonize, decommodify, and demilitarize, that is humanize, the built environment and social relations? Critical design scholars like Damian White and Arturo Escobar have helped our disciplines and professions become more aware of place and network-based mobilizations that are already occurring around just transitions. And many of them are focused on infrastructures. So these are struggles for divestment from the extractive economy based on a consumerist and colonial mindset, extraction of non-renewable resources, labor exploitation, enclosure of wealth and power, and militarism. There are also collective investments in regenerative economies that are based on caring and sacredness mindsets, resource regeneration, cooperative work, ecological and social well-being, and deep democracy. I see reparative planning and design as our disciplinary and professional corollary to just transitions, which are led by frontline communities and organizers. It refers to acts of repair, healing, and making whole that arise from conditions of brokenness and damage, but are not entirely defined by it. It centers those most marginalized by the prevailing development regime, which has enclosed land and commodified much of life under settler colonialism and racial capitalism on this land, as possessing radical insight, openness, and possibility in moving beyond them toward regenerative systems. Beyond a temporary fix or treating the system, reparative planning and design fundamentally shifts our methods, pedagogy, and culture to align with the intergenerational knowledge, situated insight, and creative practices of these frontline communities that are facing up against the first and worst of climate change. It works to decommodify space and human relationships by investing in regenerative communities, commons, and publics. And shout out to the Sweetwater Foundation that you see pictured here. And they're doing a lot of reparative planning and design. Much of the work that we'll be sharing with you today is grounded in a reparative planning and designing framework. It starts by learning from how infrastructure-based struggles and mobilizations led by frontline communities reveal and challenge social supremacies that are baked into and reproduced through the built environment. It further investigates how planners and designers can accomplish such infrastructure-based initiatives for just transition. So how our tools and methods could be more reparative. We focus on infrastructure, not just because it's pervasive and their sheer scale, but also as a means for repairing political life more broadly. As Deborah Cohen notes, infrastructure enables all manner of things, and it can foster transformation as well as reproduction. In contrast to top-down infrastructure, communities, movements, networks, and nations assemble creative alternatives that respond to needs and desires for a different future as they help bring them into being. So let's move into our work with the Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles, and their work specifically to advance transit-oriented communities and planning for equity in LA. So the research built on, so my research with them built on my my doctoral dissertation research at MIT, which was on place-based mobilizations for green jobs, and also some research I did with the Transforming Urban Transport Project at the GSD, TUTPOL for short. And that project conducted comparative case research on the role of political strategies and tactics in advancing transport changes in cities around the world. So there were 8 comparative case studies, and my colleague, David Luberoff, wrote an excellent TUTPOL case study on how LA County voters had approved a series of ballot measures to use sales tax increment financing for highway and transit investments. And so when I was comparatively analyzing the 8 cases, something that really came through among the critical tensions was this trend of transit-induced displacement pressures, which appeared especially pronounced in Los Angeles. This led me to take a deeper dive to try to understand what was happening. So the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority had moved forward with billions, actually 160 billions of dollars in the pipeline for transport investments, highway and transit investments. And that sparked a major construction boom. And half of it was in low-income communities, and 90% of that was unaffordable to working class Angelenos. So I'm citing research from the Urban Displacement Project. And colleagues at UCLA and Berkeley did some incredible work around this. And it's important to understand why that was happening, especially the fact that the biggest impacts were felt around downtown, where transit-oriented development interacted with urban revitalization efforts in historically disinvested neighborhoods. And the reason is because these public transit investments are occurring in a regional geography of race and income segregation with serious wealth gaps and highly speculative real estate markets. So histories of institutionalized disinvestment and discriminatory housing, financial, and labor markets place undue transit-induced displacement risks on working class BIPOC communities. And the research has also shown that privileged newcomers to transit-served areas aren't necessarily using transit services, but relying on private cars, their own, and Uber and the like. And meanwhile, when lower income transit riders get pushed out to outlying areas, without transit access, they're not only more reliant on cars, but also have to travel greater distances to access amenities and services. So the carbon impacts of that are substantial. And I should also say that this isn't unique to LA. We've seen sustainability packaged and propagated as a strategy for urban-based economic development, where green infrastructure investments in transit, bikeways, public spaces make cities vibrant, livable, which, there's no problem with that, but especially attractive to so-called creatives who in turn attract knowledge and service sectors. So in highly commodified property regimes, what happens is that locational values, rise up, and so do living costs in core urban areas, and that reinforces the consumptive lifestyles of those who are already the most privileged by the extractive economy, and it expands their claims to urban space. So when those with the biggest stake in the status quo are driving infrastructure development, they're unlikely to advance the deep systemic changes needed to promote social, environmental, or even economic sustainability. So this is why we see movement-led transitions as being critical, and why planners and designers need to support these frontline communities in realizing the visions of sustainable and vibrant cities and regions that they want. So through the case research and personal contacts, I learned about ACT LA and their series of policy wins. So here's a coalition of transportation advocates, community and neighborhood groups, and worker centers that had grown out of the LA-based community benefits movement, leading citywide, regional, and state level campaigns for inclusive, equitable urban infrastructure and urban redevelopment. And I'd be happy to discuss that community benefits movement during Q&A. I think it's really important, and it's it's a product of the last 30 years actually, in the following the 92 uprisings. But meeting with and interviewing ACT LA's executive director, Laura Raymond, and the transit campaign manager and legal researcher, Aziola Sankara, and their other colleagues, and becoming more embedded in their organizational spaces and processes, I was really struck by the reparative approach to infrastructural planning and design. The coalition has constantly lifted up and mobilized around the sustainable mobility patterns of LA's largely Black and brown transit ridership. And following the path of the bus riders union, they've advocated for investments in bus lines and services, which most transit riders actually rely on, notwithstanding metro priorities for rail. Additionally, they're fighting for working class BIPOC communities to stay and thrive in their beloved neighborhoods by trying to decommodify housing through inclusionary zoning and tenant protections in areas benefiting from public transit investments. And they're also channeling construction workforce opportunities to those who are presently excluded from the labor market. And I'm happy to get into these landmark policy wins during Q&A as well. So Laura Aziola and I are currently working together to write up and share out some of this work, particularly with planning and design audiences. And here are some major themes that we're touching on. So the importance of combining movement building with agonistic politics, coalition work, and policy planning acumen in advancing just transition. So stay tuned for some upcoming articles. And I want to say that so much of academic research can be extractive, and I'm so grateful for ACT LA's trust and generosity in inviting co-design students and me into the fold to get involved with their latest campaign, which Fiona, Anne, and Elifmina will tell you more about shortly. And I want to say that we're only sharing publicly available content today out of respect for ACT LA partners and members and their ongoing campaigns and movement work. As mentioned, we're doing some writing with the team members. We're also writing within our own team in the coming months. So we'll be sharing that out as it's ready. I want to recognize that JCHS has partially supported Fiona and Elifmina's time as RAs, as did some of our startup funds for co-design, which was allocated by our previous dean, Mostafavi. But I also have to acknowledge our reliance on unpaid labor through independent studies and Elifmina's thesis. This is a tension that we're, kind of facing, and you'll learn more about Elifmina's thesis shortly, but co-design is currently seeking funds to support the continuation of this sort of design, teaching, research, practice, and activism. It's important that we don't compete with partners like ACT LA, but that we're able to fairly compensate our students for the kind of work that we do. So this is a challenge that we'd certainly appreciate your advice on. So Fiona, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lily. So ACT LA leaders invited co-design to get involved in this campaign to shift funding from transit policing to public investments that center the needs of majority Black and Latinx transit ridership in the LA region. This includes better bus services, fare-free transit, and community-led safety alternatives. So as co-design, our tasks were: 1, co-designing spatial strategies with ACT LA members and allies to transform LA Metro, both like transit and public spaces, into sanctuaries or safe spaces for transit riders and neighborhood residents, as well as developing visual communication strategies and materials for the political education campaign for members, Metro leadership and staff, and the public.
So recognizing that most of the people in the audience are planners and designers, or people who work close to those fields, we did want to take some time and reflect on this part of our research question, which is really asking, like, how can planners and designers align themselves with frontline leaders and communities? What this meant in practice, in our experience with ACT LA, is that it's a lot about identifying what you have to offer and showing up prepared to list that out, but also being attuned to the fact that you are being invited to collaborate and participate, and that invitation is an expression of trust to be nourished and not taken for granted. And in our case, this invitation and collaboration was really necessary because ACT LA members, they are highly aware of political dynamics in LA and potential pressure points or points of entry for progressive action. And we, obviously working on the other coast, we were not, but we were able to ground our research and framing in that understanding of broader political goals and timelines. So in our reflections as a group and with ACT LA, we've realized that this is really relational work and it's really about building trust, which compared to a lot of other planning institutions where we've observed, compared to a lot of other planning institutions, we've observed that there is a greater emphasis on collective decision-making across every step of the process. So from articulating priorities to identifying actions and building up a constituent base. The overall process can be slow and messy, but it also ensures that you can amplify the potential impact of the work because you're giving space for others to learn, share feedback, and then to align your goals that you end up with in the moral grounding of broader movements such as Black Lives Matter, the LA County Alternatives to Incarceration report, and then other local, regional, and national organizing movements that center working class communities of color. So we just completed the policy proposal last week. I will say just a note on the title, which we all voted on in a very fun process. Metro as a sanctuary, and that framing of a sanctuary was very explicit. We were referencing widespread support in many California communities for their statewide sanctuary laws. That's just an aside, but our co-design team, we really took the lead in this process in drafting the section on planning and design alternatives, which comprises environmental design and spatial strategies that make transit riders feel welcome, comfortable, and cared for. You can see it in this little flowery diagram on the left. And it includes things like improved seating, bathrooms that are regularly serviced and cleaned, natural lighting, a lot of physical recommendations, but it also goes up to stewardship and programming of space.
Yeah, so we formatted the report and also created visual content and materials like slides and flyers for the outreach and communication campaign. And this was for ACT LA member organizations, Metro leadership and staff, as well as the general public. This report has become a major part of ACT LA's ongoing public education series, and they've hosted webinars to share the findings of the report and build support for the People's Transit campaign. And I'll drop a link to the report in the chat.
Yeah, and in addition to co-creating the report, as Anne and Fiona mentioned, as well as the visual communication materials that we talked about, we actually also began to study together and individually what we can learn from the ACT LA case about reparative planning and design practices. So here you can see kind of a screenshot of my busy Miro board. I don't know if people in the audience know what Miro is, but it's a collaborative platform to kind of gather all your research and do work together. It's been critical to our work at the design school this semester and last semester. So I've basically built my thesis research around the ACT LA case, and I'm exploring how reparative planning theory relates into practice, and specifically how ACT LA is an example of reparative planning in action, and also thinking through some takeaways that this case offers for planners more broadly speaking. So since July 2020, which feels like a long time ago, even though it wasn't that far away, I've been conducting participant observation, actively listening and learning from the members and staff of ACT LA. I've also been doing, archival research into their website and their work that has been evolving over the last decade or so. And the Miro is really where I kind of analyzed all of the archival work that I've done. And I'm supplementing this research also with semi-structured interviews with the leadership team. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so for in addition to kind of this archival research, one of the big things that we're helping ACT LA put together over this transit justice campaign is workshops, webinars, and trainings that all Fiona, Anne, and I here have been helping with the guidance of Lily, helping kind of ACT LA organizers and leaders of the transit justice campaign put together. So building on what Anne said about moving at the speed of trust and building trust and this really being a relationship, we began this partnership in July 2020. And the first 3 spaces here that you can see, July 2020, August 2020, October 2020, we were really invited there as active, allies and guests, and we were learning and observing from those who were there before us. So those spaces were spaces for us to sit in and experience. And fast forwarding 7 months, the spaces created in March, we actually joined as active co-creators and partners, and we helped out with the logistics. That could be something as easy as setting up a short bit.ly link, advancing slides or creating slides and flyers and Zoom links, and just also thinking through, interactive activities that we can do at these workshops to engage transit riders and people who join the the webinar. And it's been a learning journey for us from where we attended the first one in July to today. And it's actually really critical. I found from my research that it's critical to put in the effort and time needed to build the relationship so that a couple months later, you actually find the confidence within yourself to help them put together a workshop. Because in July, when they were asking us, hey, can you help us make workshops? No, I did not feel comfortable doing that. And I'd never been to LA. I didn't know anything. So really, it's important to put in the time and effort. And it took months of, attending regular meetings and emailing with members and staff and kind of building a shared understanding of, and also mutual respect that can be contributed to tasks in a meaningful way. I also want to point out the fact that this is an ongoing process, and we have some future workshops that we're in process of planning together with ACT LA staff and membership, and we really look forward to continuing our work with the Alliance and are excited for the next steps. And that brings me to the last slide that I'll talk about, and my thesis is actually still in process, so this is my last semester at the GSD, but I'll share some preliminary findings about transit justice and equitable urban development that I'm learning from this work. And you can email me and I can share the final work with you once it's available, hopefully at the beginning of the summer. On the right here on the slide, you can actually see some examples of the tools and methods that ACT LA has been using to advance their agendas, such as, voter guides that are posted on social media or spaces that they create through community events in parks or educational institutions. And on the left are my brief takeaways at this point. So first off, democratic decision-making and coalition building, as we've mentioned so far in the presentation, is really one of the most important things in tackling these problems at the urban and regional scale. So we want to move beyond just fighting project by project, and we want to have a broad regional kind of framework within which we operate. And for that, coalition building is absolutely critical. Creating spaces for organizing, these community events in the parks and these webinars, they're really, really important. And they're really the bread and butter of where, all people come together and come up with a collective idea of what they want to do going forward. And these spaces really need to accommodate all modes of expression and learning. Building relationships with decision makers and resource holders, this is really a way for us to move away from an us and them mindset, or like a development versus no development at all mindset, and really into a collaborative space where we work together. The next one is no silos. And recently I attended a career webinar that the GSD hosted, and someone there said, housing is where jobs go up home at night, and they go home using transit. So there really is no reason for us to silo these different, transit planners and housing planners and, climate planners. We're planners and designers, and we got to tackle all of them together. Putting current transit riders at the front of decision-making processes, this is absolutely critical for us to not repeat our mistakes from the past, or for our errors in the past not to be carried forward. If the people who are currently using public transportation in Los Angeles are able to use their visions to advance public transit in Los Angeles to incorporate more people, that's what we want. We don't want to, ignore the people who use public transit now to get other people to start using public transit. And lastly, I think it's really important as movement organizers, movement builders, and planners who are looking to disrupt the status quo to use moments of opportunity in the system to make change. You know, summer 2020 was really a moment of change in Los Angeles, where LA Metro announced that they want to, you know, rethink their approach to safety on transit, and they created a public safety advisory committee. And there's also a huge amount of investment, as Lily mentioned, $160 billion of transit investment going into Los Angeles right now, especially with the Olympics coming up in 2028. So it's important to keep an overarching timeline in mind, and you really use these moments and cracks in the system to make change. And with that, I'll pass it back to Lily for some final words.
Oh gosh. Sorry, okay, here we go. So to conclude, I want to return to one of our key research questions, how planners and designers can accomplish such infrastructure-based initiatives for just transitions, and how our tools and methods could be more reparative. So, and I want to emphasize that we're really focusing this conversation today on the planning and design side. And we want to hold up the work that ACT LA does and encourage you to visit their website, to attend their teach-ins and their various events, and please support the work that they do. As partners, we're really leading the conversation that we need to have, that we believe we need to have as planners and designs who are accomplices. So yes, this is Finn from Star Wars. Why is he here? Because he shows us how to be reparative planners and designers, to amplify one's creative and transformative powers by working in relationship and community and being guided by history and context. As some of you may know, Finn is a stormtrooper who becomes appalled by the cruelty of the First Order and decides to join the resistance, initially because of his relationship to Rey, but eventually because he is deeply committed to the cause of intergalactic freedom. Finn uses his insider knowledge of First Order facilities and modus operandi and awesome technical skills and swordsmanship to advance the rebel cause and achieve victory, which is intergalactic freedom. So to be like Finn, or really a reparative designer and planner, here's some of sort of what we see as key. So cultivating a keen sensitivity to issues of power, not just histories of dominance and formal authority, so power over, but also community struggles and political formations where historically marginalized groups build power with differently situated and enabled others, and exercise collective power to reimagine and reiterate urban infrastructure and spatial development. And two, building relationships with transformative place-based organizers where we are. And, you know, these can start with just looking up groups on things like Facebook or Twitter, showing up, going to meetings, you know, volunteering to take minutes and just do things when asked. Three, it's important to consider why and how we show up. This is a recurring, you know, topic of conversation for co-designers. You know, it's important to challenge our own agendas, assumptions, and preconceived ideas, you know, trying not to take space or growth opportunities from frontline leaders, doing the personal work that we need to do on our own time, and not just sympathizing with injustice, but reflecting on how we're actually implicated and using our identity, privilege, and networks to amplify existing movement-based efforts to shift power and resources. And then finally, using professional knowledge and skills to advance movement goals and priorities, and not just enact the, you know, planning and design excitement that we often carry. Sometimes it's helpful to reiterate spatial forms, structures, policies, and programs as we do in the studio setting. And sometimes it's more helpful to just support regenerative spaces and practices where communities can heal and grow. And, you know, as Fiona and Anne and Elifmina touched on, the more trust we gain along the way and the more understanding shared understanding we have about what we can do together, more opportunities open up. So I'll conclude, I'll end there. Thank you so much for joining us today and allowing us to share this work with you.
Lily, thank you. Just a really provocative and interesting presentation. There's a question in the chat that I'm going to tweak a little bit. The question starts with what do we know about the housing that you talked about, particularly in downtown LA? That is there any evidence that building housing, increasing the supply, might slow or halt displacement? But so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But also, you've spoken a lot about the work related to Metro, and I'm wondering, have you been doing any work, or what, if you're not, what ACT LA is doing around the housing issue, which would presumably involve different public entities in Los Angeles?
Thanks, David. So this being the Joint Center for Housing, I understand there's a lot of housing enthusiasts and experts in the room, which I so appreciate. And I know that there are a lot of expert opinions, but also conflicting opinions about whether, increasing the supply of housing will halt displacement. My own understanding and assessment is that building more housing will not halt displacement if the housing is unaffordable to working Angelenos or Bostonians or whoever. And as we've seen housing commodified, it's become a instrument for investments. And there's a really great video, is it a TED Talk, but about how the Blackstone Group is one of the biggest landlords in the United States. And so as a vehicle of investment and less, right for people, like a place for people to live, just simply increasing the supply, I don't think will necessarily help people, people who need housing and can't necessarily pay for the luxury housing that's being developed. And in London and other cities, there's so many cases of empty housing, luxury housing, that people just hold on to that don't, they're not living in them. So for that reason, I think decommodifying housing as we build housing, decommodifying it the way that ACT LA advocates for is really key, strengthening tenant protections and ensuring that the housing is not just built, but affordable and, secure for people who need it. The second question that you posed about Metro and the housing issue, we haven't gone there. We've really been focused on building the relationship and the action research with ACT LA. David, you did such an wonderful job with the case that you wrote on LA. And I know you spoke with political officials, and I mean, the breadth that you covered in terms of the perspectives of, policymakers and the various coalition, leaders, especially from the environmental and transit advocacy communities, was really impressive. We've been really focusing on the community and environmental justice sort of organizations and those who are fighting for affordable housing, and really kind of crafting the work around their interests. But that would be a good sort of next step.
I'm thank you for the compliment, and it actually makes me wonder, in preparing that case study, one of the interesting conundrums, and I'm wondering how you think about this as planners. What you've seen with ACT LA was, when do community groups essentially become confrontational? I think the word you used was agonistic, as politics, which I actually looked up, and it's combative or polemical politics. And when do community groups decide that a half a loaf might be better? And I'm wondering whether what you're thinking about the role of groups like ACT LA, which has been very effective primarily as a more confrontational group, and whether that there are ever been discussions about, or you've been part of those discussions about, when is the confrontation the right strategy and when is cooperation the right strategy?
Yeah, I love that question. I don't know if it's either or. I think it's both and. I think it's a combination of collaboration or sort of enlisting allies, who are in agencies. And I'm sure there are so many in this room who can really support ACT LA's vision and are in, agencies and organizations that make important decisions. And so oftentimes it's working with those sort of champions who share the values, and also mobilizing the grassroots transit riders to exert pressures on political officials to support certain measures. So it's that sort of dissensus, and kind of agonistic politics that is really dynamic, I think. And, some people talk about inside outside strategies. But I think both of those are really critical.
There's a question in the chat about, or not in the chat, excuse me, a question in the Q&A. That's sort of a design question, which is the questions are started from the point of saying that when they think about shelter, metro and shelter, they literally were thinking about shade in a place like Los Angeles. But I'm wondering more broadly, to what extent does the campaign or the discussions you've had with people about metro focus on the sort of policing issue, and to what extent is it focusing on the design questions of what is the actual space like as an experience for the people who are waiting for buses or waiting for trains?
Yeah, I want to invite Fiona, Anne, and Elifmina into this part of the conversation because they've been present for months, in these ACT LA sort of committee and meeting spaces. And this work of so police have a monopoly on the definition of safety and security. And this seems to be the case in LA with transit spaces and public spaces too. And so the work that we've been doing with ACT LA is to kind of chip away at that monopoly and think about, what does safety and security look like beyond policing and surveillance? We've had a lot of it. It's not that effective. People don't necessarily feel safer. Some people are dying as a result of that. So what are alternatives? And, ACT LA members and leaders, they've become really interested in sort of more environmental design approaches. We now have a critique of CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design in our field. We're very skeptical of it, thanks to, DAP Design as Protest and the design justice movements. We have that very healthy skepticism and concern. And ACT LA has been leading the work to imagine then what should environmental design look like if it's not just defensive, but it's centering comfort and belonging and, and play. And, what does it mean for a public space or metro space to be a sanctuary? So Elifmina, like the workshop or the conversation we had last week, people drew things, shade was definitely there, right? I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we did the workshop where we shared out the report and asked people to draw their ideal sanctuary. And shade did come up in two ways. Shade is really important, obviously, with trees, but also just like shelters of buses. And in the trees, some things that really were interesting and striking to me was some people had suggestions of like the trees specifically being fruit trees so that you can have a snack while you're waiting for your bus, thinking outside the box a little bit. And then one participant actually pointed out that we should make sure to place trees in a way that doesn't disrupt the view of the bus driver. So if the bus driver is approaching a stop, the tree shouldn't be blocking the view of who's waiting for the bus, because then the bus driver might just skip them. So those were two kind of tree and shade related things that came up at the webinar.
There's a question here about how to bring the public in difficult conversations. And I could sort of think about that in two ways, and picking up off of a theme that's at least in one other question. When might density be appropriate? So some of the questions about what kinds of development in new communities, in terms of talking with community members who are often split on this issue, and then also, and really a separate question, how do you think about having these kinds of conversations with the real estate community, which at least in Los Angeles and the rest of the United States in 2021 is a profit-driven entity? So how do you structure these broader conversations to both take into account difficult conversations in the community, but also the sort of political and economic realities of the times?
That's a hard question. I don't
It's my
have
job.
a single, answer to that. For me, and I think Laura Raymond or Aziola Sankar, I think I think people might answer differently. For me, it's critical to see that what we're doing now is not working. Sustainability, sustainable transport, it's not working. People are not using transit more in LA as a result of billions of dollars in investments. And when we privilege those who are most, the biggest beneficiaries of the extractive economy, that's not necessarily going to advance sustainability. So whether we're building more housing in ways that serve them, or whether we're building transit to serve these most privileged and, extractive and wasteful groups, and I can be included as that part of that too, with my urban lifestyle. It's not working. When we support these frontline communities that are already leading with their actions and have visions that they're organized around, I think that there's way more hope and more transformative opportunities.
I might also add that the reason that the movement is at the center is that it's about confronting the political and economic realities of today. Like the quote that people often say about organizing, which is that organizing is changing what becomes possible. So I think that kind of future-facing positive ethos runs throughout a lot of the work of ACT LA.
Just following on that, there's an interesting question here about the role of wealth building strategies. So not only keeping things affordable, but whether any of the work is focused on wealth building, which again, in the American context, has often been around home ownership.
That is such a great question, because when we talk about displacement, it's so often focused on housing and not enough on the fact that people's incomes do not allow them to afford the housing, right, that's being built. And labor deregulation and, sort of median or mean wages going down over time, like these are all important with the housing crisis, subprime lending, and, the fact that certain racialized communities were targeted. That has had a detrimental impact on wealth, right? So wealth strategies are so important. With ACT LA's work, especially with their transit-oriented communities, work with Metro and with LA City, there has been inclusive workforce policies so that jobs are targeted to people who are excluded from the present sort of construction and building trade sort of career pathways. So there is a lot of thinking around that. It's not just about jobs, it's about family sustaining jobs that allow, the accumulation of equity of wealth. So that seems really key. I also want to bring up other cases. So the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, for example, in New York, that's another case that I'm beginning to look into. I'm working with the partners there, and they have a very explicit and intentional wealth creating sort of wealth creation strategy, and it's infrastructural in a different way. So here with ACT LA, we're talking about transport infrastructures, right? They're actually building infrastructures of economic democracy. So they're creating everything from like a policy and planning lab to a popular education platform to support, cooperative economic thinking, to Bronx Exchange that brings together procurement demands by the anchor institutions with local businesses and workforce intermediaries and labor unions. And so they have a very infrastructural sort of approach to community wealth building that is also about development without displacement. So there's different ways.
You actually anticipate my next, and what I think will be my next to last question, which is advice or every effort is both specifically local but may have lessons for other places. And I'm wondering what you take away from some of the work in LA and the Bronx, the other places you're working, as sort of foundational for people who are interested in doing this kind of work in both urban and there was a question about whether you could apply it to rural communities as well.
Yeah, I don't know, David, I feel like you and I are kind of biased toward comparative research. There's so much to learn from going deep into cases and then trying to translate lessons to other places. LA is really instructive because the coalition building there is seasoned, it's really matured, I think. It's very mature. There's so much to learn. And for me, it's been really helpful to compare it to what's happening in Boston. So we have transit investments in Boston, commuter rail, the Green Line extension, all these things are also posing displacement risks, pressures on historically disinvested in those neighborhoods. And it's happening in Lynn, it's happening in Chelsea, it's happening in Mattapan, it's happened in Somerville, And I think it would be incredibly powerful to have a regional coalition building approach. We have a lot of data that's being collected, and the Sasaki Foundation has been so great in funding data initiatives. One that I'm a part of, Mattapan Mapping Project, which is a community-based sort of inventory of oral history and cognitive maps and spatial data about neighborhood-based change. The Sasaki Foundation has seed funded, and there's others like that. And what the co-investigators, Alenza Michelle and Lori Goldman and I talk about is, really ramping it up to a regional scale and thinking about building partnerships with other neighborhood-based, because we work with the Greater Mattapan Neighborhood Council to ensure that our data is informing the work that they do. But what if we could do this at a regional scale, And so that's something that we've directly taken from the LA model to hopefully we'll have some traction on that in the coming years.
I want to wrap up actually with a building on that. Part of what's really fascinating about this work is that, as you said at the start, it's an effort to bring planning students, out into the community. And so I'm wondering what I'm going to ask you two ways. I mean, what kinds of lessons have you learned in this work? And I'd be interested in the students, as advice that you would give to others who are interested in doing this. And part of that would be, was there anything that particularly surprised you as you went out as something that was either unexpectedly easy or unexpectedly difficult?
I love these questions about, what were some surprising things that you encountered, right? I want to turn to Anne or Elifmina because they did that, and they were brave. They jumped into the context. They're not from LA. And Elifmina, do you want to chime
think of it
in?
also as what advice would you give for students, thinking about taking a class like this? What should they be looking for as making sure that it's going to work?
One thing that when you said surprising, that came to my mind is, so as somebody who's, never been to Los Angeles and never been on a Los Angeles bus or anything like that, I went into it not knowing anything about the context. And often, especially in this virtual time, that's how students in these classes go into their sites. And we have this anxiety of, oh, how do I know enough about my site if I can't actually go there? But I found it really easy to understand the conditions through Google Maps. And I mean Google Maps Street View, like if you drop the little person into the street and actually like go through the streets and find the bus stops and look at what the bus stops look like. Can you find the bus stop on the street? Like, is it clear to you where the bus would stop if you had to wait there? And at first I thought it would be really hard to get a good sense of how things are going. And that felt like a surprisingly, easy way of understanding the site. I also did read your entire case study, and that was helpful in understanding the context.
I'm glad it was helpful. Anne?
I think one thing it felt like a big pedagogical shift in working with ACT-LA is that at design school, you're very used to people centering themselves and their ideas and their design. And that's a very different kind of structure than how ACT-LA runs, where it's truly like every meeting is it's giving space for everybody to speak. When you author things, you might notice on the report, there's not individual authors' names listed, it's organizations. And that's explicit because it's about, everything is about a group of people coming together and working on something. And I think that, coming from a design school, it's something that you come to learn, like how to be in partnership with someone. And yeah, you just sort of learn a different language. That's almost how I feel about it. It's a different way of practicing.
How much of your work was kind of just design work of develop what we think of as the classic work of design, developing a scheme, bringing it to the community, and how much of it was preparing materials, kind of using the designer's eye for ideas that in some ways had been fleshed out, or being kind of the planner, in particular planner as community organizer. Just there's so many different ways to be a planner, and I'm just wondering which kind you mainly were here.
I think so. It's a lot of everything. So you definitely have to bring a critical understanding of design and planning, and some ideas about interventions that would be helpful given the context, right, of transit spaces and public spaces. However, it's all very much an allied, collaborative way of working. So we worked with lawyers, we worked with public health experts, we worked with social workers, people who support unhoused individuals. So it's combining what we know, but definitely owning what we know as sort of spatialized, sort of spatial experts with these partners. And it's really just jamming, and it's such an exhilarating and incredible process of like creating with them. I think we've learned a lot from the lawyers who are a part of this movement lawyering sort of approach. And we've been talking about what it means to do movement planning and movement design, to really think of our skills as aiding movements. So David, it's really just bringing a lot of different skills to the fore. The other thing I wanted to say is how this work, it feels very whole in a way. Like a lot of us as planners, as designers, have values, we care about things. And going back to Grace Lee Boggs's question, what does it mean to be a human at the 21st century? It means so many things. And oftentimes our work in agencies and institutions don't allow us to be that wholly human that we want to be. And we compartmentalize ourselves to a disservice, you know? And I think with the ACT LA work, we really got to be our full selves. Like I got to be, you know, the proud LA person that I am, the ex-organizer that I am, the researcher, the teacher, you know, the mom who loves to ride transit with my son. Like it really kind of was liberating in a lot of ways. And I think rather than warn, like I would just invite other planners and designers to join in this work, because it really is restoring and it's exciting.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Unfortunately, although as we expected, we didn't get to everyone's questions, and I apologize to those of you who posed questions that we didn't get to. We will share them with Lily and the team in case there's something they want to follow up on. As I've been listening, I've been thinking about and reflecting back. Lily was a moderator for a half-day symposium we did last fall on equitable development, and in the framing of that, Alex von Hoffman, our colleague, you know, talked about there's a couple of longstanding issues that we've always dealt with as in the planning and urban politics. You know, one is how to in real ways involve the community, and ACT LA is an amazing example of a group that's been working on this for quite a long time, as Lily noted. And the other is really thinking about the role of what is it that planners do and bring to that conversation. It is really exciting and stimulating to see this 2021 iteration of that longstanding question, and what interesting ways Lily and the team that she's been working with have done that. I want to thank you for a terrific presentation. We don't get to clap, but know that we're clapping, and invite those of you watching to join us again on April 9th for the 5th and next to last session of our Housing Research Seminar, which will be on the $15,000 question: who did down payment assistance programs help, and how should they be designed? Which will be a conversation between Chris Herbert, the director of the Joint Center, Rahim Hanifa, one of our research analysts who's been examining this question, and Ben Ward, a former center researcher, all looking at this question about down payment assistance programs, which is particularly timely given that this is on the agenda for the Biden administration. But for this moment, just to thank Lily, Elifmina, Anne, and Fiona for a terrific and provocative presentation. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great afternoon.